We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Ha-Joon Chang, who's one of the leading critics of the mainstream development theory. He taught at Cambridge University for several decades, and he's currently a professor of economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. So thanks for joining us, Ha-Joon.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start with just a very general question. What do you see as the major flaws in the development model that's pushed by the IMF, the World Bank, what used to be, and I guess it's probably still called the Washington Consensus? What do you see as the biggest problems with that one?
Well, I think there are layers of problems here. So at the very surface level, the mainstream economists, namely neoclassical economists, so that, yeah, let's first make that clear. I mean, neoclassical economics is not the same as neoliberal economics. So there are neoclassical economists like Joe Stiglitz and Paul Krugman, who are not neoliberal, but I'm talking in broad terms as the neoclassical economics. So, sorry?
They're the good guys.
Yeah. But indeed, even indeed, broadly defined neoclassical version, I think the most fundamental problem is that, neoclassical economics starts by accepting the existing distribution of wealth, income, and power as given, and also accepting the existing levels of the capabilities as given. So what happens then is that if you are taking the existing distribution of income, power, and wealth, and take this idea of Pareto improvement, meaning that you cannot hurt even one person a tiny bit in order to make the rest of society better, then you build in a very conservative bias. So you don't touch the asset distribution. So you don't talk about things like land reform. Yeah? You don't talk about the fundamental restructuring of the people's entitlement and so on in the form of the expansion of the welfare state and so on. So that's the one problem. But in the longer run, the bigger problem is that neoclassical economics takes existing capabilities, especially productive capabilities as given, which means that countries are encouraged to stick to what they're already good at. Yeah? So this is the notion of so-called comparative advantage. Yeah? So that you are a poor country with lots of labor, very little capital. You should specialize in the textile, the making trainers, the stuffing toys, and then that's how you develop. Yeah? And I think that's the real problem, because there are the neoclassical economies who would support more state intervention and so on, but they are all thinking about those interventions all in terms of existing power structure and existing distribution of capabilities. So when developing countries, say South Korea, tries to develop an automobile industry in the 1970s, when its main export was basically textile and garment. I mean, mainstream economists used to say this is insane. Yeah, I mean, you are banning the importation of all foreign cars. Yeah, and you are giving massive subsidies to your local car companies, and you think this is a good economic policy. Yeah? So it is a recipe for accepting the status quo, and this is why the developing countries have been doing far worse in the last 4 decades of neoliberalism than under the days of so-called import substitution industrialization in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when they tried to protect local industries, develop local enterprises, develop worker skills, and so on. now that they are just opening the door to whatever the world will throw at them. And as a result, they've been all kind of growing much more slowly than what they used to.
I remember there was a line, and you might know who came up with it, but I date it to at least the early 90s, if not the 80s, getting prices right. And basically that meant getting the government out, so you don't have tariffs, you don't have subsidies, you get prices right. And
that's right, yeah. So that in those days, especially, now it's a bit softened, but in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, getting prices right meant basically abolishing all government intervention, opening up your borders to foreign trade and investment completely, basically accepting that the prevailing world prices are the right prices. And of course, this is why the late Alice Amsden, one of the most trenchant critics of the mainstream development economics in the 80s and 90s, said that we have to get the prices wrong, yeah, because what these people say, right prices, are never going to get that these economies develop.
yeah, it is striking, obviously, well, we've both been around a long time at this point, but I remember back to NAFTA. NAFTA, of course, gets approved by Congress in 1993 under Bill Clinton, had Republican support as well. So fingerprints all over that. You can decide who you want to blame, but everyone, mainstream, both parties are very much on board with that. But in any case, at that time, what was said here to push the deal, that supposed to be good for the U.S., but also it was supposed to be good for Mexico. And they said, this was will increase trade and it will help Mexico develop. It will increase, convergence. In other words, Mexico would get to be as rich, maybe not as rich, but it will close the gap. And
That's right.
maybe
Well,
not
unfortunately, Mexico has been literally one of the most slowest growing economies in the whole of Latin America for the last 30 years.
Yeah, it was one of these things. Of course, I and many were monitoring Mexico's development closely, and I remember there was this is still a source of frustration. It was 10 years after the pact, so this had been it took effect in '94, so I think it would have been 2004, maybe it's 2005 to have the full 10 years. I remember they had a series of pieces that the World Bank put out, and they had one that said, "Oh, look at this, wages are converging." We're going, how on earth can that be? Because we knew the data. And we looked over that, and one of my colleagues at CEPR did the work on this, David Rosnick. He did it. I think Mark Weisbart also worked on it, but David was the one who did most of the work. And he's going through it, and he saw that all of their convergence was based on basically an error. They were using nominal exchange rates, which any economist would say makes no sense. And they took Mexico's exchange, the value of its currency plummeted. There was a crisis. So just after NAFTA went into effect, I'm not saying that was the reason, it's a longer story, but the value of its currency plummeted and then it rose from that. So based on that, they were saying that, the wages converged, and we're going, that makes no sense. And I don't think any economist would disagree with that basic point, but they refused to correct the paper. I'm sure why I haven't looked, but I assume you could probably still find it on the website. So the reality was, the divergence increased. It's not that the U.S. grew so greatly, but our economy's done okay since NAFTA, 3 decades plus now. Mexico's economy hasn't.
That's right. Yeah. No. It's actually quite disturbing, because in all the debate about alternative policy models, I mean, there have been so much the kind of one-sided presentation of data and ignoring of the inconvenient facts, and that the East Asian so-called economic miracle is the best example. Indeed, the 70s, 80s, I mean, the mainstream economies, including the World Bank, they were arguing that, well, these countries didn't have much state intervention. That's why they grew. They had the free trade, free market policy. And I still remember Bella Balassa, who was one of the leading mainstream trade economists, he wrote in this article in the late 1980s, saying that, other than the steel and shipbuilding, South Korea had no industrial policy. What are you talking about? I mean, we had I mean, this was a time when the financial journalists would go to South Korea and say, this is the most controlled economy outside the Soviet bloc, yeah? Because we had the planning ministry, which controlled not just the economic plan, but also the budget. All the banks were basically owned by the state, yeah? Every industry was under some kind of program, some more the kind of draconian than others to basically push these firms into investing in building production capacities and training workers and doing R&D and so on. And then if they perform, they were getting lots of subsidized loans from the state-owned banks and so on. And then there were these respectable economies going around saying that these countries, Korea, Taiwan, these countries didn't have industrial policy. So,
No, I was just going to say, I think people may not appreciate, the incredible progress South Korea has made. And I remember in one of your books, I'm sorry, I can't remember which one. I once have read them all, read a number of them. One of them, you begin with this story from when you were growing up in South Korea, and you were the first family in your neighborhood to have a refrigerator.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so actually people brought this the food to be kept in the refrigerator. So my mother would keep them in the refrigerator and return them when they need it. Yeah, I mean, when I was born in the early 1960s, South Korea's per capita income was half that of Ghana's, 1/3 that of Senegal's. Yeah, life expectancy was like 52 years. So I should have been dead for 10 years now because I'm turning 60 this week. 62 this week. And yeah, from there now we are. I mean, yeah, we are not Japan, Germany, but it's a country with $35,000 per capita income. The leading producers of all these high-tech goods and so on. And yeah, getting there required huge amount of state intervention. Of course, many of these interventions were done to kind of help business rather than suppress business in general. But the direction was very clear. That, for example, the one famous story is that LG, the famous Korean company, which is the leader in the flat screen displays and one of the leaders in the electric car batteries. It started out as a cosmetics company. Huh? So it was making the face creams and the toothpaste and so on. And then it wanted to kind of do more stuff, and it tried to get a loan from the government because at the time all the banks were owned by the government to build a textile factory. And the government said, no, you can't. I mean, I already have too many textile factories. You should do something a bit more high tech, like making electric cables. Yeah. So they said, okay, I mean, if that's what you want, if that's what you are going to give us money for, we'll do it. And then from there, it grew into a major electronics giant. Yeah? So, that business always want an easy life. Yeah? So you have to push these people into doing something slightly better than what they could be doing today. And yeah, so it was a very, very controlled and directed process. But of course, they don't talk about it. I mean, they talk as if all of this came out of free trade, free market, or at most, I mean, the more kind of sanitized version of the development economics the popular today, like Acemoglu and these people emphasizing, the South Korea had good institutions, yeah. But what does that mean? I mean, that in their kind of theoretical argument is that basically, Western or even the more narrowly Anglo-American style property rights system and so on, where government the activities are restrained and there's a huge respect for private property. But look at that South Korea in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, the government was everywhere. It owned all the banks until the mid 1980s. There, there would be incidences where the government would just take all these loans away from the underperforming businesses and just drive it into bankruptcy if it didn't comply with the industrial policy. So, that's
Yeah.
now another version of the kind of mainstream economics that basically trying to defend, the private property and market-based interactions.
Now, I remember when the East Asian financial crisis hit, which of course caught up South Korea, caught up everyone, everyone throughout East Asia, even to a lesser extent China, but it did hit everyone in that region. And I remember there were circulating stories that in South Korea that none of the chaebols that that you had these conglomerates, probably isn't exactly the right word, but groupings of companies that they weren't allowed to fail. And I remember, I think you were the one who did this. They listed the 10 biggest, and you pointed out that like half of them weren't there a decade ago.
Exactly. Yeah. So I had that. At the time wrote that 10 of the biggest business groups in the 60s. Two of the 10 biggest business groups in the 60s survived into the 70s, and only 5 of the biggest 10 in the 70s survived into the 80s, and so on. So the discipline was brutal. Yeah.
So they were creating this myth that, again, it just defied reality. And that was widely circulated here, as I'm sure you know.
Exactly. Yeah, so anything that would imply that all these successes were somehow compatible with the market-based system, or any misleading data that would show that some of these countries may have had bad things. Yes, Korea was especially until the 90s, very corrupt, and there were many bad things. But they were. When these countries were doing well, they said, "Oh, it's all because of their market-oriented policies." As soon as they do badly, they suddenly talk about corruption, which they never used to talk about. So you can never win. When you control the narrative, you can just dodge the bullies in any way you like.
Yeah, I remember I had occasion to be I was at a conference in Seoul, and it was about 2009, 2010, somewhere there about. I have to say, I know the data. I'm an economist. I look at the data. I was still struck. It was really, you go around Seoul, and I'm not going to say I went through the whole city because it's a huge city, but the parts, and I didn't just stay in. Obviously, I was mostly in the more upscale.
Sure.
But it was very impressive. Walking around there, you wouldn't think it was any different if you're going around, European city.
That's true. Yeah. But having said that, I am very proud of what my country has achieved in terms of economic development. But it has become a very sick society. We have failed to make the transition to a more welfare-based social arrangement. So now we have the lowest birth rate in the world, the highest suicide rate in the OECD, highest old age poverty rate in the OECD, the highest gender wage gap in the OECD. It's at another level of very, very sick society. But, that's exactly because the government wouldn't be as interventionist in terms of social welfare as it used to be in terms of industrial policy, because we have one of the smallest welfare state in the OECD. Actually, if you count only rich countries, we have the smallest, because the other OECD countries that have the smaller welfare state, meaning social spending as a proportion of GDP, then South Korea is the Mexico and Colombia, not really rich countries.
Let me ask about that. It's a little different, a little field. But what is the resistance to that? It's widely taught. obviously we're not in Korea. They don't necessarily care what people in the United States say. Maybe it's good they don't care. But I mean, what are the attitudes in Korea that prevent that? I mean, they must recognize, I mean, obviously declining birth rates kind of an obvious thing, and not one of these demographics, but whatever. I mean, people should be able to have kids, and they don't feel they're able to do that.
No, it's quite sad because it's a combination of a number of things. I mean, one thing you have to remember is that because we are still living the Cold War. It's the last place on Earth where the Cold War still lives. So there has been this long tradition of anti-communist ideology. So political spectrum in South Korea is very truncated because I would say that even the 80% of the congressmen in the supposedly more progressive party that is in power at the moment, they are to the right of Angela Merkel. Yeah? So that the politics is in general very right wing, but the secondly and the more importantly, there's a lot of misconception of.
Because we're both old. For people who may not be familiar, Angela Merkel was the prime minister in Germany, the chancellor for 20 years. She was a conservative. So
exactly, she was from the conservative Christian Democratic Party.
Yeah.
What is that conservative in Germany is that quite progressive in Korea in terms of welfare and the equal rights and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's one sad the long run current. But another is that basically some right wing politicians have been playing this kind of divisive game in which they are pitting young men against young women. Yeah? So that a lot of young men who are not doing well are told, look, it's all because of this overly aggressive, upwardly mobile women that you are in this position. And that these men have become very kind of anti-feminist. And most young women cannot take this. They don't want to have a boyfriend. They don't want to have a kid because, I mean, when your, the husband or the partner demands that you become what the Americans these days called tread wife. I mean, they say, hang on a second, I'm better educated than you are. I earn more money, and you are telling me not to, continue with my career. So there's that. Then, I mean, because
well, that's a very unfortunate story. Obviously, we have that here, and I mean, not to that great extent.
Actually, the
Women
US
are the labor force.
like Korea in that sense because it's the stark choice become very stark in countries like the US or South Korea with weaker welfare state. Because that then women either have to choose their career or give up having children. U.S. still has a fairly high rate of births because of immigration and so on, but Korea doesn't have that. So now we are on the road to the racial extinction, which may not be a bad thing, but
I like to joke with German friends. What's the problem? But bad joke. But anyhow. So let's get back to development. We were talking before about how, in effect, we always see them moving the ball. I'm just going to hit on my favorite topic, which I know I've talked about with you many times, with intellectual property, with patents and copyrights. And it just drives me nuts that we have so many economists who, these are government-granted monopolies. And they talk about them as the free market. Now, there are policies that arguably are good in many cases. I mean, I wouldn't say all patents are bad. That'd be a crazy, crazy thing to say. But they're policies. They're not the government. They're not the free market left to itself.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how so many economists, it's like saying black is white. It's like,
no, it's really sad because people at least used to be more honest in the old days, in the 19th century. No country had Ministry of Defense. They were all called Ministries of War, because that's what they do. Yeah, in
industrial
those days, there was actually a very strong anti-patent movement in Europe led by free trade economies because they saw the contradiction. Yeah, this is a government sanctioned monopoly. We are in favor of no monopoly. We are in favor of government not favoring some people. So we are against it. And the Economist magazine, which these days is one of the most kind of aggressive defenders of intellectual property rights, was actually the leading voice in this anti-patent movement in the 19th century. And yeah, at least some free trade economies were able to see the contradiction in the early days of the WTO, which massively strengthened intellectual property rights. Jagdish Bhagwati, I mean, who at one level is a ridiculously the ideological defender of free trade, but at least he said at the launch of the WTO, he said, what is intellectual property right doing in the WTO, which is supposed to be a free trade organization? Yeah? I'm actually not a free trade economist. I mean, so I can defend the intellectual property right, but free trade economists are defending it is the self-contradiction. And, even if you accept that intellectual property rights can be quite important, can be positive, and so on, you have to strike a balance, yeah. Because that if you create these monopolies, there are all sorts of problems that come out of there being these monopolies, yeah. And there are issues with calculating just the desserts, yeah. I mean, 80-90% of the money that went into developing COVID vaccine, they were public or the charitable money. Yeah? But who has the intellectual property rights? The pharmaceutical companies. Yeah. So how come the taxpayers pay 80% and then get nothing, whereas these pharmaceutical companies get 100%? Yeah.
The treatment of, well, not just vaccines, but COVID treatments more generally during the pandemic was just, and to this day, it's very little talked about it. I mean, to my view, and maybe this sounds really extreme, but it was a worldwide pandemic. You would just share all the technology. I mean,
absolutely.
we could argue, you could even give the companies their money. I mean, they want to get a lot of money. You give Moderna, you give Pfizer, the other AstraZeneca, they all put in some money, no doubt about it. But get the technology out there. We can argue later. I mean, this is like, I don't understand why, to my view, this didn't even seem like an arguable point. Let's save lives because we can't bring those people back. And of course, it's a collective action problem. If we slow the pandemic spread, fewer people get it, fewer people die, and we all benefit. But for some reason, well, I shouldn't say for some reason, but it was never even on the agenda, and this is the case. Just
when India, Brazil, and a couple of other developing countries try to have the WTO suspend the intellectual property rights on the COVID vaccines, the rich countries push back like hell, and
they filibustered. They said, "Oh, we'll talk about it," and we're going, "People are dying. Like, why don't we talk about it later?" And again, it was just, I didn't understand, because people who, I think are at least reasonably intelligent. I'm thinking like the people who are editors at the New York Times, writers at the New York Times, like they didn't understand. Like we could let people have the technology now and argue over how much the companies get later. Those are independent decisions. One has nothing to do with the other. But you couldn't make any headway. And you're right. You're very much right. India and some other countries were pushing for that. And the response here was, "Oh yeah, we'll talk about it." Oh my God! Like what plan? Anyhow, I'm sorry. That's my diatribe.
No. I mean, we've seen it in the debate around HIV/AIDS, the drugs in the early 2000s when the 42 Western pharmaceutical companies tried to take the South African government to the country's constitutional court against the South African government's decision to allow so-called parallel imports. Yeah, so the South African government argued, look, if we want to keep the HIV, the AIDS, the positive person, the HIV positive person healthy with the Western patented drugs, it costs like the $12,000. Yeah, that was when South Africa's per capita income was like $4,000. Yeah, but if we do it with coffee drugs that imported from Thailand, Brazil, India, because at that time these countries were still allowed to make these coffee drugs, we can do it with $300 to $500. Yeah. So are you telling us that we cough up 3 times our per capita income to give to the Western companies when we could do it with 10% of our per capita income? Yeah? I mean, we've seen it. We've seen it in this COVID crisis so many times. You know, these the drug companies are just taking everything. And yeah, I mean, I think that we need really the more honest conversation about these things, because you know, okay, I mean, for other things you can, you know, give away more, but when it comes to life-saving drugs, I think there's just no argument for putting profit before people's lives. Yeah?
I had an earlier segment, Jamie Love, who worked on a really kind of an amazing story that I think the reason why I had him on, I want more people to know about this story, because, you know, at that time, you know, exactly what you're referring to, the drug companies here, you know, it was a great innovation, you know, so AIDS at that time was, you know, basically a death sentence. We had one drug, AZT, which, you know, ameliorated the symptoms, but after, you know, 2 years, 3 years, it differed across people. It stopped working and you were going to die, you know. So it was a death sentence, and they developed a cocktail of drugs that were incredibly effective. People basically could live indefinitely, a chronic disease. You know, there were side effects. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but, you know, and they've improved them since. But in any case, you know, what it meant was that people could live, you know, relatively normal lives with AIDS, and they were charging $12,000 here. And it was just this outright lie. They were saying, "Oh, that's what it cost us." You know, we couldn't sell them for, you know, they at some point they offered a discount of $6,000 or $7,000. You know, but again, you know, and you know what you're saying. India proved it. You know, you had manufacturers in India, Thailand. They were doing it for $200 or $300. You know, so what they say they're producing. You know, and what, you know, Jamie was able to do. You know, he made the links between, you know, the manufacturers. I think it was primarily India. And ultimately with the U.S. government, they got George W. Bush, a conservative Republican, to support an AIDS program for Africa that saved tens of millions of lives, you know, because they could buy him for $200 or $300. You could get an aid program that could pay that. You can't get an aid program to pay $7,000 or $10,000. I mean, you're not going to be able to give it to a million. I mean, maybe we should, but you know, that just wasn't the real world. But when you said 200 or 300, yes. So that is just an amazing story. And you know,
exactly. Despite that, these drug companies kept arguing that, if you don't give us patents, there'll be no more new drugs. But that's another lie, because I don't know, they stop publishing that data, maybe because it's too embarrassing. But even according to in those days, according to the website of the American Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, the U.S. drug companies was spent the financing only about 45% of drugs research. Yeah? The rest of the money came from the government, mainly through NIH system, and the universities and other charitable institutions. So even in the extreme case where we abolish patents, half of the drug research money will be there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I actually, you know, obviously I know Jamie's a friend, and he's working with, you know, a group of people. I'm involved with them peripherally, and they had done case studies on, you know, what was the research that went to 4 breakthrough drugs and who paid for it. And it was amazing to me because, you know, I've followed this. Again, I'm not an expert on it, but I have followed it. The bulk of the money came from NIH or from universities or from charities. And these were important drugs. So this wasn't like, this, little obscure drug that they thought would be a good idea. These are important drugs.
Yeah.
And it is amazing. I mean, to my view, I would have all of it, paid for up front and, let them be sold. Let's have the free market, because,
Exactly.
again, point I've often made on this, and I'm going to shut up in a second, drugs are cheap. We make them expensive with patent monopolies. And, people think I'm crazy when I'm saying that. I go, no, they're cheap to manufacture and distribute. It's very rare that it's expensive to produce and distribute a drug. There are probably some exceptions to that, but that's really the exception.
Yeah, think about the money that you will have to waste in terms of end of life care and everything if you don't treat people with the right drugs at the right time. Yeah, because especially in the US, many people do not have health insurance. They can afford expensive drugs, and then they become sicker than they could have been, and then they end up in the public health system. Yeah, and in general, the health system, which is costing the US 80% of its GDP, compared to the 12% in other comparable countries in Europe.
Yeah. So, okay, I've been doing my diatribe on patents and
No. These are important because somehow, this intellectual property, this monopoly has been somehow absorbed into the free market economics. So not even free market economies are criticizing this.
Yeah.
Which they used to in the 19th century. Don't forget.
Yeah, and you mentioned Jagdish Bhagwati, and he's an excellent example because, again, he's totally free market. If we had him here, he would say, "Yes, I'm totally free market." He would not dispute that at all. But you're exactly right.
He's smart and consistent enough to see that this isn't nonsense to have free trade and drugs monopoly and other intellectual monopolies. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the ironies, people often say, "Oh, we wish we had the what was it, our Pacific, the deal that Obama,
TCPPP or something like that." Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason they didn't get that through was they were fighting over the intellectual property issues. Because the U.S. wanted very strong intellectual property laws, and the other countries were resistant to it because otherwise it would. I'm happy they didn't get the deal, frankly. But in any case, they delayed it for probably 2 or 3 years, and at that point, Trump came into office. We're thinking 2017 now, and he said no. It died. So anyhow. So let me ask again some general questions. Getting back, what do you see going forward in development economics? Are we going back to the dominance of the neoliberal view? Do people appreciate it's obviously South Korea's success, but we could look at China. I mean, China's just again similar to South Korea, just an amazing success story that they're now. It's still a much poorer country. It's poorer than South Korea, but I mean the progress it has made, and certainly. In the most cutting edge industries now, in artificial intelligence and, obviously in green technology, they're off the charts. But, we're still living with the world of neoliberalism.
Yeah. Not that, China is a bit like the whole of Americas together. Yeah. So, I mean, from Paraguay to the Silicon Valley. Yeah. So it's not a normal country in that sense, yeah. I mean, the countries are so big, so diverse. Yes, so at the cutting edge, it's like, I mean, I just saw this the article today saying that the Chinese are now, very near toppling the South Koreans and the Chinese from chip making the top spot. Yeah, they are now about to join the Dutch in making this the high-tech lithographic machines that you need to etch circuits on semiconductors and so on. Yeah, so at the cutting edge, they are as good as anyone. So overall, it's still a developing country, but you cannot think of it in the same way that you think of, I don't know, South Korea when it also had that $15,000 per capita income in the the late 80s. Yeah, I mean it's another world. But yeah, I think the world is going to change. I mean, of course, the academia always changes after the world changes. So I'm not hopeful about my academic colleagues coming up with great new ideas to change the world. But for example, when I was doing my PhD in the 1980s on industrial policy, my PhD dissertation was later published as this book called The Political Economy of Industrial Policy in the 90s. When I was doing the research, when I told people, oh, I'm doing research on industrial policy, I mean, people look at me again and look at me as if I just said, I don't know, I mean, I'm a Satanist, or my PhD is on proving that Elvis Presley is still alive, But now, I mean, in his absolutely crazy and doomed way, even Donald Trump is trying industrial policy, with the success of China, the other developing countries are saying, hang on a second, we have been told that the American way is the best way, but who's winning this economic competition? And then now the developing countries are less kind of cowed than they were in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s under all these the permanent structural adjustment programs. Yeah, now they are, becoming a bit more confident. They are exploring new alliances, and yeah, increasingly I get invitations from many governments to talk about industrial policy, including places that would have never done that even 10 years ago. So I think that the practice of development will change, and then maybe the economies will follow changing reality and rewrite what they have been saying. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a possibility. I guess we could hope so. So it's one of the ironies, I guess, that we could say sort of a good outcome from the Trump craziness is that, you no longer have the smile being imposed, because Trump probably doesn't even understand it. It doesn't matter. They're not, he's clearly not following it. He doesn't pretend to follow it, and he doesn't tell anyone else to follow it because he wouldn't even know whether they are or they aren't. So, in that sense, that might be, well, I would say it undoubtedly is a good thing for the rest of the world. I'm not going to say other things Trump's doing good for the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that other countries are now, they are not quite doing it yet, but they are daring to think about inventing a new world economy without the United States.
Yeah.
So
I don't say it's necessarily the ideal situation, because you'd like the United States to be on board on that, but that's the world we're in. So anything else we should hit on before I let you go? I've taken a lot of your time here.
No, I think how the progressive forces in the U.S. that comes up with an alternative vision for the country and for the rest of the world is going to be so critical in the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah, because the world is changing. It is going to change. But if we keep having the United States like what we have at the moment for another decade, then the changes in the world will become so much distorted and lopsided and so on. So I really hope my American friends to get together to come up with a more credible alternative.
Yeah, well, let's hope we could do that.
Even hope, yeah.
We want the U.S. to be a constructive partner with the world, not.
I'm not saying this in a facetious way, because the U.S. is a unique empire.
Yeah.
Which empire didn't destroy the vanquished? When they won the hegemony? Which empire had Marshall Plan? Giving away that 1% of GDP to the rest of to Western Europe for 5 years? Which country that set up this multilateral system where they voluntarily gave up some of its power. So it was a very, very unique, and yeah, I mean, it did lots of bad things too, but you know, the most
It was,
empire that humanity had. So
to use an overword phrase, I think it was a genuine case of enlightened self-interest.
exactly, yeah, yeah.
And
So
it
that
obviously
a
benefited the
country,
U.S. and at the end of the day, benefited much of the world. I can say everyone all the time, but
yeah, sure. Yeah, so I really hope that the country can live up to its former self. Yeah, I mean that's that in my view what is going to make America great again. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thanks a lot for joining us. Great talking to you again.
Sure.
We'll have to talk more. Maybe we'll talk again in a year or so and have some good stories to tell about the U.S. role in the world. Thanks.
Okay, great.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.